All right, let's get started. We only have a limited amount of time, so I want to make sure that we get the most out of our conversation with our two incredible guests. Thank you so much. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this conversation with Common Sense. Today, we are reflecting on Latinx representation and celebrating real Latinx stories in content for children and youth. And again, I want to remind you that we will have the Spanish version of this conversation in exactly 1 hour. La charla en español comienza en 1 hora. We are bringing you this segment in collaboration with Momento Latino. Momento Latino is a growing coalition of activists, leaders, and artists lifting our voices and pushing for change. So please follow at Momento Latino on social media for more information on this amazing growing movement. And for those of you that are new to Common Sense, we are the leading national nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families thrive in this digital age of media and technology. And today, we're hearing from two incredible content creators and storytellers, Susie Jaramillo, President and Creative Chief Officer of Encantos, a children's educational media company, and Julissa Arce, author of My Underground American Dream and Someone Like Me. And so let's start with Julissa Arce joining us today. She's an amazing author and activist. Hola, Julissa. Thank you for joining us. So, getting right into it, Julissa, just a few years ago, you wrote your first book titled My Underground American Dream, My True Story as an Undocumented Immigrant Who Became a Wall Street Executive. This book is a national bestseller, and recently you published a young adult version for ages 10 plus, Someone Like Me. Can you take us through your journey and what inspired you to write your story?
Yeah. So thanks so much for having me. And, a big shout out to all the parents that are having to do everything that they already do, plus teach their kids at home with virtual learning. So shout out to them. I came to the US when I was 11 years old. And when I was 14, my visa expired and I became undocumented. And, those first few years of living in the United States were quite challenging, not only because I didn't speak the language, but also because I felt like I didn't exist in this country. I grew up in San Antonio, Texas, where everywhere I looked, there were people who looked like me, who sounded like me. My classmates in school, there was a lot of Latinos and Mexican American students that I went to school with. So in my community, I saw myself reflected. But as soon as I turned on the television, as soon as I opened a book that was assigned to me by a teacher at school, when I went to the movies, when I listened to English language music and radio, I was nowhere to be found. And so not only was I going through this really difficult experience of being an undocumented child, but I had to go through it alone. It was a very lonely journey because I didn't know other people who were going through my same situation. And so that made me feel truly alien. And so, fast forward many years, I was eventually able to get citizenship, and I write about all of those years in between being 14 years old and finding out I was undocumented to being 24, 25 years old when I got my green card and eventually becoming a citizen in 2014. There's a lot that happens there. And so I encourage people to read the book. But, fast forward all those years, I wrote my underground American Dream first. And as I was going to universities and as I was going on book tour, there were a lot of parents that would ask me, have you thought about writing this story for kids, for my kid? Because I would love my daughter to read your book. I would love my daughter to read your story. But there are things in my underground American Dream that, that are adult things, and they're not necessarily for a child to read. And so when I started getting asked this question, I immediately thought, absolutely, because I think my life would have been significantly different had I been able to read a story like mine when I was in the 6th grade or in the 7th grade. If I had known that, there were other kids who were going through what I was going through. If I had somebody else tell me that not speaking English, there's nothing to be embarrassed about, because it was something that I was quite embarrassed about when I was a child. I was embarrassed of my accent. I was embarrassed of so many things, because the world around me would tell me that that it wasn't okay to be someone like me. And that's why the book is called Someone Like Me, because someone like me can. And so when I used to visit before the pandemic, when I used to visit schools, I used to ask kids to fill in that sentence, someone like me can. And they would say things like, someone like me can be a doctor. Someone like me can be a teacher. Someone like me can be an author. And it was so rewarding to know that the book is making a difference in children's lives, and not just on the kids that can see themselves reflected in the story, but also kids who have never been exposed to these types of stories, because it's important for them to read other people's experiences in this world as well.
Julissa, you're already making me teary-eyed. I don't know why. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day, by the way, and I recently found out in my ancestry DNA that I'm 33% Spanish and 44% Indigenous. And so I'm celebrating my Indigenous roots right now. I'm like, I want to shout it from the rooftop, and I can't help but think that even like something like that, you're right. Like we were not reflected in the media when we were growing up, and it's so important for us to tell our stories. And you were talking about, specifically, parents that were coming up to you wanting you to tell your story for young adults, right? And I wanted to provide a little bit of context. I found these statistics, and we're going to include the sources to these statistics in the chat. Of the approximately 3,134 children's books published in 2018, only 5% had Latino characters.
Yeah.
A recent study on the diversity gap in children's book publishing acknowledged an increase in diverse books being published since 2014, up to 31% by 2017. However, the number of books written by people of color has not kept pace, and Black, Latinx, and Native American authors combined wrote just 7% of new children's books published in 2017, up by 31%, 7%. That something doesn't add up, and that's why we're having this conversation. And I wanted to ask you, Julissa, as you've been touring schools around the country as a guest speaker, what has it been like connecting directly with young people, and what has been their reaction to your story?
Yeah, so that statistics that you just shared, I'm quite familiar with them, and I always like to tell people that you're more likely to find a truck or a bunny in a children's book than you are to find a little brown girl in a children's book, because trucks and bunnies are represented at something like 12 to 15%, depending on the year. And you just mentioned Latinx characters in children's books at 5%. So that's how underrepresented we are, and that I think illustrates the problem. And so it like I say, it's so rewarding when I go visit students, and I really miss being able to interact with students, because there's a program that takes authors in Texas, and they take us to Title I schools, and they give every child that we're visiting a copy of our book. And for many children, is the first book that they've ever owned, is the first book that they get to take home with them, that they don't have to return to the library. And there's all this research about how much that increases the likelihood that a child will read at their age level just because they own a book in the home. And so when I've been to these programs and I visit these kids, they'll write me letters, and I wish I had some to show you, but I don't have them right with me. But they write me these letters where they tell me that for the first time that they don't feel embarrassed that their mom is undocumented, or that they themselves are an immigrant. There was one kid who was an 8th grader, and he said to me, and I'll never forget this, he said, "Miss, I don't really like to read, but I loved your book so much, and it gave me feelings." And I just started laughing, because I thought how cool that a 13-year-old kid is getting falling in love with his first book. And I think that's that to me is part of the solution for like a lot of the education issues that we see, which is that if young readers are able to see themselves reflected in the books that they read, they're more likely to want to read them and to read them again and to become interested in books in general. Because if they're always reading stories where they feel like it has nothing to do with their everyday experience, then you're not going to find that interesting and you're not going to want to continue to read. So I think that the more that we are able to tell authentic stories, and I'm a big believer that we should be telling our own stories, because what you just mentioned about there's an increase in Latino characters or in Latino books, but they're not always written by Latinos for Latinos. And I'm not suggesting that a writer can only write about his or her own experiences, because then we wouldn't have fiction, right? But I do think that until we have a significant increase in representation of us being able to write books for us, then people who are outside of our community need to take a very hard look about the way that they're writing about us and making sure that they're doing their due diligence and doing their homework to tell authentic stories.
Wow. You're so right. I want to remind everybody, please feel free to submit your questions. We are going to take one, if we have time, two questions. So feel free to submit them in the chat. But Julissa, I wanted to, we don't have time to go too much into this, but you recently did an interview panel with Oprah where you were talking about this same topic, about representation in publishing specifically. And you mentioned, we were talking offline in the green room, and you mentioned this anecdote about some tweets that you were watching, that you were seeing with President Trump. And I was wondering if you can share that story.
Yeah, so this is a story that I shared because it really impacted me, which is that there was a teacher in Texas who thought she was sending private messages, but she was actually sending public tweets. And in those tweets, she was saying things like, please send immigration enforcement to my school because my school has been overrun by illegals. And it really broke my heart because I thought I was one of those illegal, and I hate that word, of those undocumented students sitting in somebody's classroom. And I cannot imagine being in that kind of hostile environment, trying to learn in an environment where a teacher, because of the way that I look, assumes that I don't belong there. And I think as a Latina writer, and this is what I shared when I was on Oprah, is that as a Latina writer, I'm often asked to make my stories more relevant and to make them less angry. And I have to say that, my stories are relevant, but the question is relevant to whom? Because the publishing industry is 85% white. And so when I'm being asked to make my stories more relevant, I'm being forced to make them more relevant to a white audience instead of making them relevant to people in my community. And so, that's what I shared, because I'm more interested in writing books for her students so that they feel seen and understood and loved, and that they know that their stories are important, than I am about trying to change her mind. Because other people will try to do that with their writing, and I'm glad that there are other people who want to do that. But for me as a writer, I always want to write with our community in mind. And to be honest, I've read so many books that my favorite book when I was a kid, and I still have that same copy from the 6th grade, was Where the Red Fern Grows. It was a white kid with his 2 dogs, but I love that book, because there's certain things that are universal. And so I hope that that's what people really get, is that even in our stories that are specific to our community, there are universal truths that translate to every community.
Thank you so much. I'm listening on Audible to My Underground American Dream. I recommend that everybody buy their copy or listen to it on Audible. And I also noticed that Someone Like Me is also going to be available on Audible this month.
Yes, I just recorded it. Yes, I finished recording it.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We have one question. If we can answer this question very quickly, someone is asking, what other stories do you have inside you, Julissa? What other stories can we expect? And feel free to let us know other horizons, other projects on your horizon.
Yeah, thank you for asking that. So, so my Someone Like Me is also in Spanish. It's called Alguien Como Yo, and I am starting to mull over a novel about these cheerleaders in Texas, which will be a very new, exciting project once I get to it. And my next book, it's called Rejecting Assimilation. It's a nonfiction book. It's I don't know what the age will be yet, but it's a book really about celebrating what makes us unique. So that's coming out next year.
So we can all look forward to these very, very cool, exciting projects. Also, make sure that you follow Julissa on Instagram at Julissa Arce. Julissa is also doing some Instagram series, one called Las Noticias, featuring the previous week's latest stories that have to do with the Latinx community. And also you just finished your series on La Historia Uncovered, where you interviewed other authors. So please make sure to connect with her. Thank you so much, Julissa. We will see you in just a little while para la plática en español.
Sí, nos vemos en un ratito.
En un ratito. Let's bring on our next guest, Susie Jaramillo. And there she is. Hola, Susie. And I'm so excited to talk to you, Susie, because, oh my goodness, I'm already just like so inspired on, all the things that we have to do for our community, not just for us, but for our children's generation. Totally. And you are very, very involved in creating amazing content for children. So, Susie, you're the co-founder, president, and Chief Creative Officer of Encantos. And I want us to get a little bit more into Encantos. But before we do that, can you tell us a little bit more about your story, your influences, and the driving force that led you to starting this company?
Sure. So my story is a little different. My mother is half Ecuadorian, half Irish, and my father is 100% Latino. 100% Venezuelan, perdón. And I was actually born in Venezuela, but my mother always made it very clear I was an American born abroad. And then my family moved to the United States, and I spent my early childhood in the United States. And then when I was 10, my family immigrated to Venezuela. So I had the immigrant experience, al revés, as an immigrant to Venezuela. And so I experienced all the same things that an immigrant does, but immigrating to Venezuela, learning Spanish, going to school in Spanish, having my family there just embrace me and share all of these wonderful cultural things. And I just sort of fell in love completely with the culture. And then when I was 15, just very abruptly, my mother decided to move us back to the United States. And so there was like a culture, it was like a break almost, right? And it was a really difficult transition. And here my formative years had been spent in Venezuela, and I had just gotten the swing of things. And now I was back in Florida, and the cultural difference couldn't be more marked. It's just so different from a 15-year-old to be in Venezuela versus a 15-year-old in Melbourne, Florida. And so I just developed so much affection, and I quickly started to identify as a Latina, as a person who was very Latinoamericano, very Latin American, but at the same time, a person that was very American with the values instilled in me by my mother. And so these dual parts of me have always been very important. And people would ask me, what do you prefer? Your Venezuelan culture or your American culture? And my perspective was like, why do I have to choose? I get the best of both worlds. And so I studied art, and I love cultures, and I love art, and I consider myself to be an eternal student of culture. And when I came into being, and you kind of, it takes a long time to figure out what you want to do as an artist. I decided that the best way I could use my artistic skills was really to serve my community, to elevate our culture, to share our stories, and to empower families and moms and dads to be able to share our culture with their kids.
Wow, that's incredible. And as an artist, you're an incredible artist, by the way. I love looking at the visuals of Encantos, and that's what I wanted to talk about next is Encantos. How did the idea come about, and what are you all doing in terms of creating beautiful, bilingual, relevant content for Latinx and all families, but bilingual in English and Spanish, beautiful content for children?
So Encantos really is a beautiful story because it's two families that came together, right? It's my family, so myself and my husband, Carlos Hoyos, who's from Colombia. And then our business partners are Stephen Wolf Pereira and Nuria Santa Maria Wolf, and they are Dominican and Salvadoreño. So we've come together to form Encantos, and we really want to create entertainment education properties for children. So we believe that learning is bigger than education, and that children learn best when they have fun, and that you can create wonderful, inspired properties that have strong, compelling characters and worlds children want to live with, and you can actually educate children with these properties. And so the first property that we created was one that I actually dreamed up when I was raising my very small babies when they were like 2 and 4 years old. I was like, how come there's nothing out there that brings all of our wonderful nursery rhymes together in a beautiful world that is just wonderful to share with little toddlers so that they can appreciate our culture and they can sort of fall in love with Latino culture? Because I really do think if you want your children to love your culture and love your language, you have to start really, really young, because once they hit 5, 6, 7, everything cool is in English, you lose them. So it's really, really important to start to expose them to your culture and your language and to inculcate that pride in who they are at a very young age. And so that's what Canticos is all about. Canticos takes all of our wonderful nursery rhymes, Los Pollitos Dicen, Un Elefante Se Balanceaba, and many, many, many more, and it presents them in a world of music and learning for your children.
And they're truly incredible because I'm a grown adult and I really love them. Like, I really love to listen to these songs. I'm a very, very musical person, and I was ever since I was a little girl, and there was nothing. I mean, my mind was blown when I discovered Annie, right? I think I was like 5, and I loved it. But man, I wish there had been like a little like a Latina character that looked like me that I could sing along to. And instead, I started watching telenovelas.
I know.
Which is not a good example for little girls. Not good content. Mama's not
not good content. So I mean, you raised such a great point. So we started with nursery rhymes, and these nursery rhymes have animal characters, and I feel like they serve their function, because one thing that nursery rhymes do is that they transcend generations. So you can be Spanish dominant, la abuelita, el primo, el tío that doesn't speak any English, and you'll appreciate Canticos, and you can be English dominant, like the mom or the 2nd, 3rd generation child, and you can create a bond between those two individuals through these nursery rhymes. But they also unify our countries, right? Because whether you're from Argentina, Cuba, Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, todos, we all sing Los Pollitos. So I feel like it's a little bit of glue that glues our communities together in a country that really needs glue. Like now more than ever, as a Latino community, we really need to come together. So I think we need to rally around what brings us together. And then as we look at other properties that Encantos is creating, we are absolutely looking at creating character-driven properties that represent children, whether it's Isa's Edible Adventures, which is about a little girl who is half Black and half Indian, and she thinks food is love, and she loves food, and she travels around the world putting wonderful dishes together and teaching kids about nutrition, about empathy, about culture. Or whether it's Tiny Travelers, which really introduces children to the different countries of the world and invites them to fall in love with culture. Whether it's Skeletitos, another sort of personal favorite of mine, which is a kind of a Tim Burton spin on Day of the Dead. We're really looking at elevating our culture and showing kids that, hey, this is a really fun world that you're going to want to play in.
That's so incredible. Offline, you shared an amazing quote with me. I think it's your quote, but it started with "Great characters are." Can you finish that quote?
I mean, great characters are characters you fall in love with. Great characters are characters that you want to play with. Great characters are unforgettable. I don't know if that was my quote, but
I love that. It was great characters. I wrote it down actually. Great characters are friends that teach children through learning, song, dance, fun, and then the list.
I did say that. I need to collect that and save that for later.
We're going to create an image with that quote, and then
go ahead. That's true.
By Susie Jaramillo.
No, the fun thing is kids are naturally empathetic creatures that want to play with friends. And so when you present these characters as friends that they can play with, you lead them into a world of learning, right? So that is exactly what we want to do with the properties that we create.
Amazing. Well, we're going to check to see if we have questions from our viewers and listeners. And we do, from Ben Frank. Thank you. Is there a list of Latinx books and authors I can get for middle school? Ben, I'm so glad that you asked that, because Common Sense, we have a ton of curated best of lists where we curate really, really great content, from books to TV shows to films, and we categorize it by grade level. So please visit commonsense.org to find not only our large online catalog of ratings and reviews of all children's content, but also our best of lists. And I actually also want to take this opportunity to invite everyone to connect with Common Sense via our social media platforms, YouTube, Instagram, or Facebook. And actually, now you can also receive the Common Sense tips and advice via text right to your phone. All you have to do is to receive these tips in English, send the word kids to 21555. Or if you want to receive them in Spanish, send the word familia to the number 21555. So it's available in English and in Spanish. And this is especially great for parents of young children, 3 to 8 years old. We just send you all of our amazing Common Sense tips and advice right to the palm of your hand. This is a free resource from Common Sense, but message and data rates may apply. So please check your plan. Let's see if we have any other questions from our audience. And in the meantime, I would love to invite everybody to also follow Susie Jaramillo and Canticos World and Encantos. Which is the best social media handle that?
No, that's okay. The best handle for the one you can remember is at Canticos World. That's really the one to remember. You can follow me too, but I'm more personal with my posts. It's at Su Jaramillo. But Canticos World is really the one to follow if you're interested in everything in Canticos. Encantos, our brand, is the one place that you can go to. Encantosbrands.com. That's where you can go to if you want to see all of the different brands that we in our family. Right now we have Canticos, we have Tiny Travelers, we have Isa's Edible Adventures, and we have Skeletitos.
Thank you. Sorry about that. My mic was muted.
It's okay.
We have one more question that we have time for, and it's from Kathleen. Thank you. Kathleen says, Encantos is a great place to start. Do you have items that reach into items like fractions or other math concepts?
That's a wonderful question. So if you download the Canticos app, you'll see that we get into early math for preschoolers. So the Canticos app is really targeting early learners. We're looking at children between the ages of 3 to 5. So it's more about number literacy. It's more about counting. It's more about really, really early math concepts, some early addition, some early subtraction. However, moving forward with Isa, we are planning into getting into fractions, because you know what? When you cut a pie in half, or in quarters, you can intuitively weave fractions into cooking. So this is how we weave 21st century skills and basic life learning and math skills, and learning skills into every single brand that we create. When we do Tiny Travelers app, there's probably going to be a little bit of currency, math in there. If $1 is 100 pesos, how does that work, right? So with every single brand that we do, we are going to look into how we bake in our learning curriculum.
That I love that. I love, $1 is 100 pesos. I remember going as a little girl, visiting my family in Mexico, and I would have to do all those calculations.
Totally.
So even just the fact that the way that you're introducing math concepts into something that is so culturally relevant.
Yeah.
So Susie, I just want to thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. I'm sure that the audience is getting a lot of really great resources. And I want to invite everyone to check out, again, the Common Sense resources. We are also really care as an organization to provide relevant content for our Latinx familias, including our monolingual Spanish-speaking families. So please check out our Common Sense Latino resources and follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram to keep up with all of our offerings. I'm Rocio Lopez, Manager of Community Partnerships for Common Sense, and it was just a pleasure to have this charla with our guests. Please make sure that if you speak Spanish or if you know somebody that speaks Spanish that can benefit from this conversation, invite them to join us in just half an hour at 4 p.m. live Pacific time and 7 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you soon.